Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today. My name is Anita Robinson, and I'm going to be your moderator for our workshop, which is titled Race and Disabled Childhoods. Sorry, yes, I'm super nervous, but we'll get through this. It is titled Race, thank you, and Disabled Childhood. This workshop will explore understanding of intersex, of disability and race, and strategies that will support inclusive play of diverse children. You will be able, to which you as the audience will be able to discuss a systems level understanding of how racism and ableism affect children and their families, as well as policy implications. So for our workshop today, and who will be presenting will be Alison Smith, who is a graduate of the Masters of Arts in Early Childhood Studies program at Toronto Metropolitan University, and holds an honors degree in psychology, neuroscience, and behavior from Masters University. Yes. Alison has worked as an early childhood development project in Nicaragua and Rwanda, with a focus on supporting teachers in early childhood and inclusive education. Alison has worked in a community-based research for nearly a decade, both as a community interviewer and coding analyst for the Black Experience Project, and the project coordinator with Inclusive Early Childhood Services System Project. Alison is currently a PhD student in Social Justice Education in Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, University of Toronto, and partially load facility member at Humber College. Her research interest includes Black disabled childhoods, Black girlhood, global childhoods, and anti-racist early childhood education. Yes. She is a proud mother of two. I must say, she has a 4-month-old, so kudos to you for being here. And a lover of all things fitness, wellness, and holistic living. Please help me welcome Alison Smith.
Thank you so much, Anita, for the lovely introduction. So, as Anita mentioned, I do work as a project coordinator with the Inclusive Early Childhood Services System project, which will be part of my workshop presentation today. And I'm a PhD student in social justice education at the University of Toronto. And as she mentioned, I do have 2 young children, so I have a just turned 3-year-old who's currently in full-time childcare, and then my 4-month-old who I've left at home with my partner for the first time in a long time. So I'm so happy to be here with you today to facilitate this workshop and have some engaging discussions about the topic of the Summer Institute for this year. And because my research also grounds itself in Black feminist theory, so my PhD dissertation is being done within the Inclusive Early Childhood Service System project. We call it the IECSS project for short. So that's an acronym you may hear me saying quite a bit. And it's important for me, being grounded in the Black feminist theory, to, of course, share my positionality with you all as we're exploring this topic of race and disabled childhoods, and what equity and access means for Black families navigating the early years sector. So I did share with you first, of course, that I'm an academic, a researcher, also a mother of 2, so my grounding in this research has certainly extended, especially over the past 3 years, of becoming a mother and thinking through Black families' interactions with service systems, navigating anti-Black racism, and what that means for families and what that really looks like on a day-to-day basis. And wanted to start off with kind of a short story, again, being grounded in that Black feminist thought orientation. So literally just this week, my sister-in-law, who is returning to work in June, she has an almost 18-month-old, called me frantically saying, they just called her with a spot finally. She's been on 18 different lists in the city of Hamilton, waiting anxiously to hope that she gets a spot for her daughter, and was nervous, of course, right? About to leave this little one that you've been with for the last 18 months with strangers, thinking through so many things. One of her questions was, the center where my son is now, she hasn't yet been accepted in it, but she was wondering, what are the teachers like? Does he have Black teachers? What's the food like? So many different questions. And these are, of course, what's on the minds of many Black parents, Black mothers, Black fathers, as they're thinking about where to send their child and what the experiences are going to be for their child when they're in these early childhood education and care spaces. And so, of course, although she's thankful, that thankfully a spot has opened up. Now we have, of course, our $10 a day plan that's rolling out, and it's made it more accessible for her in the sense that it's more affordable, but she has limited choice, right? She's waiting for the centers to pick her to be able to access a spot. And so we've come a long way in the fact that the Canada Wild Early Learning and Child Care Plan has now opened the possibility for accessibility in childcare for all families, but questions about quality care and inclusion still remain. So for this workshop, this is kind of our agenda for today, and building off of the previous keynote presentation as well, she did share about thinking through intersectionality, so I am starting with that as kind of laying the foundation, again coming from a Black feminist perspective, laying that foundation, looking at ableism and racism and some hidden assumptions regarding ableism and racism specific to childhood, because I think sometimes people think, there's a sense of innocence, or it's not really fully being applicable when we're thinking about young children, but it's very applicable, and so just recognizing that. And then looking specifically at the research findings through the IECSS project and what that can help to tell us about a systems level understanding of what's going on and also implications for policy. So, in terms of what is intersectionality, so when we think about disability and race, we have to acknowledge the term intersectionality. That was first coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw in the 1980s. So how many of you are familiar with the term? Just by a show of hands, just so that I understand. Okay, so there's a mix here. So we'll definitely spend some time just kind of clarifying the term and laying the groundwork. So I do have a short video that helps to explain the origins of the term and the ways in which it can help us to think about race and disability and how they intersect.
Good for time. You want me to remind you? Is this yours?
What is intersectionality?
Oh, you guys can't see.
Intersectionality is a way of understanding social relations by examining intersecting forms of discrimination. This means acknowledging that social systems are complicated and that many forms of oppression, like racism, sexism, and ageism, might be present and active at the same time in a person's life. Everyday approaches to building equality tend to focus on one type of discrimination, for instance, sexism, and then work to address only that specific concern. But while the career of a young, white and able-bodied woman might improve with gender equality protections, an older, black, disabled lesbian may continue to be hampered by racism, ageism, ableism and homophobia in the workplace. Intersectionality is about understanding and addressing all potential roadblocks to an individual or group's well-being. But it's not as simple as just adding up oppressions and addressing each one individually. Racism, sexism and ableism exist on their own, but when combined, they compound and transform the experience of oppression. Intersectionality acknowledges that unique oppressions exist, but is also dedicated to understanding how they change in combination. The roots of intersectionality lie within the Black feminist movement, with legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw originating the term. Crenshaw felt that anti-racist and feminist movements were both overlooking the unique challenges faced by Black women. She stated that legislation about race is framed to protect Black men, and legislation about sexism is understood to protect white women. So simply combining racism and sexism together does not therefore protect Black women. Intersectional theory is now applied across a range of social divisions and also to understandings of domination, such as those associated with whiteness, masculinity, and heterosexuality. Intersectionality is not only about multiple identities, and it's not a simple answer to solving problems around equality and diversity. It is, however, an essential framework as we truly engage with issues around privilege and power and work to bring them into the open. Intersectionality means listening to others, examining our own privileges, and asking questions about who may be excluded or adversely affected by our work. As importantly, it means taking measurable action to invite, include, and centre the voices and work of marginalised individuals.
Okay, so when we think about diversity and inclusion, and specifically thinking about race and disabled childhoods, we have to engage with intersectionality. And oftentimes in the early years, inclusion is considered specific to disability, and diverse and involves aspects of identity such as race or religion, gender. So intersectionality challenges us to understand how these oppressions work in combination, right? Together, and not thinking of it in kind of an additive way. And furthermore, intersectionality is often considered in the context of adulthood, but not as widely thought about within childhood. We also know that children are developing their identities and may not hold, people assume that they may not hold as much social and political weight in certain spaces that they do for adults. But in early childhood, as children are forming their perceptions of the world around them and with each other, they are already being influenced by intersectionality. And kind of piggybacking off of the previous keynote as well, when we think about intersectionality, it means listening to others, examining our own personal privileges and biases, asking questions about who may be excluded or adversely affected by our work, and then taking action to invite and include and center the marginalized individuals and their experiences as well. So I actually joined today's institute just in the afternoon session. Unfortunately, did not get to see the first keynote, but in thinking through what you have experienced so far today for the Summer Institute, I do have a question. When we think about now what is intersectionality, how is that relevant to our work, especially when we're talking about disability and race. So has there been something within today that has challenged your thinking in relation to understanding intersectionality, what that means for you personally, what that means for you in your work, and I'm just open to anything you might like to add in thinking through this reflection question.
Anyone? Oh, we have a question over here. Go ahead.
So I come from a standpoint where my personality, I suppose, is a graduate student. So coming here, there's often times that I can always like share the things that I've learned in research, but it's really nice to see like those who are directly involved with the EC and early childhood and all that planning and all this stuff in one big room, sharing like very similar notions and ideas.
that. So it's kind of enhanced your perspective in terms of what it actually looks like on a day-to-day basis for those engaging with children in early childhood spaces. Yes?
One thing that's freaking me out a little bit when it comes to the intersectionality is if families who are vulnerable aren't able to access the system, we have families that can actually afford full fees, even though the whole thing's subsidized. I don't know how we're protecting space for families that have children with exceptionalities.
Yeah.
Right? And not to say that I think there's an increased vulnerability. Thank you. Even though I think I don't need it, right? No. And I think the other thing that's happening for me right now is there might be, some greater correlation in terms of not just looking at ability on its own or disability or exceptionality on its own, but how that intersects with the vulnerability. So I don't think those are mutually exclusive, but I'm also having a hard time now realizing that there actually is a bigger issue here that we haven't quite concretized, I think, as a system. Nancy? No. Okay.
You want to respond first, Alison, or say anything?
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. That's such an important observation, and that does help to highlight when we think about the intersection, right, of race and disability. So within the IECSS project, the project we actually interview families who have a child with a disability and interview them once a year to find out how they access supports for their child in their community. And we've actually had the opportunity to interview them from when the child is within childcare or before they enter school, all the way up into grade 3. And over 100 participants that we've had in the study, people are still being turned away from childcare, right? In terms of the center says, you know what, your child has too many needs, we can't accommodate you, you can't come here, which is obviously a human rights issue, but that's something that is still happening. So now, coupled with, as you mentioned, kind of that vulnerability of families who really need that space if they have a child with a disability, but then on top of that, if they're experiencing racial discrimination, experiencing poverty, how does that look compounded? How can we actually hold spaces for those families that really do need it and are vulnerable in that sense? Nancy, go ahead.
I think you just said what I was going to say in terms of that overlay of poverty and poverty reduction strategies being so important in the conversation.
Absolutely. Okay, we'll take one more comment.
Do you want me to just use my big voice?
Sure.
Okay. Okay. Yes, and in our community, thanks. In our community, we are working on figuring out ways to hold those spaces for children who have always experienced barriers to accessing licensed childcare. And of course, the issue is, in a perfect world, there'd be enough spaces for all children. But what I am thinking about and wonder and bracing myself for and how do we get ahead of is the lashback from privileged families who will not have as easy a time to access the limited spaces because we are removing the barriers. They are very privileged families, are very used to being able to access those. And so I worry about and think about how do we manage as a community, as a society, the backlash and the potential political pressure that will come from that, and the tensions that will be created by the simple fact that we are, and I'm saying this is absolutely the right thing for us to be doing, but I am bracing myself for that pushback, and certainly I'm already hearing You know, what about me? I need, you know, I'm white, but I need childcare, or, you know, I have middle income, and we are saying we get it. You know, in a perfect world, we have enough spaces, but right now, we know that families who are Black, Indigenous, racialized, and have children with special needs, that those families are not able to access even the system we have now, are at a huge disadvantage. So we're trying to equalize the playing field to allow that to happen. But I know it's coming, and I know that there will be a strong voice of the privilege. And then, of course, in this world of social media and misinformation and all that kind of stuff, I worry about the polarization that it may cause as we move forward and do this really important work.
Absolutely, yeah. So there's going to be tensions, right? There's going to be ups and downs. It's not going to be a seamless rollout, absolutely. But of course, the focus in terms of when we're thinking about race and disability is protecting those spaces for those families, right? And so for the next topic, I actually wanted to share a bit about thinking about racism and ableism in combination. And some of the hidden assumptions that sometimes we have as educators or as professionals working with young children. So when we build on the concept of intersectionality, thinking about ableism means discrimination in favor of able-bodied people. And oftentimes it can manifest in more covert ways. So this image shows you kind of the iceberg analogy when you're thinking about a topic. Looking above the surface, those are the things that are really obvious, but then what lies beneath the surface that we're not really thinking about or focused on. So when we look at this ableism iceberg, as I'm going to call it, we see some socially acceptable examples of ableism that could be relevant to the early years and to childhood. So some of them specifically that I'll mention are when we're thinking about ableist curriculum, the ways in which we're creating curriculum, and even to think about it from the perspective of race, trying to decenter the more Eurocentric and white approaches to education and developmentalism that are obviously permeated throughout early childhood education, but really trying to decenter that and bringing other voices, bringing in other ways of knowing. Often with young children, we also kind of think about sometimes when we have young children with disability, kind of the cute trope, so kind of not really valuing who they are, but kind of minimizing their identities as well. Sometimes people have low expectations for children with disabilities, and also there's of course the issue of exclusion and seclusion. As I mentioned, families sometimes being denied childcare spaces because their child has a disability. It also mentions the preschool to prison pipeline, which is something that's well documented and researched in the United States. Not so much here in Canada, but certainly relevant when we think about the intersection of race and disability and people that are incarcerated. And so what were their experiences in early childhood? Were they labeled as a young child, and have those labels and difficulties kind of follow them into adulthood? So I also wanted to just highlight two specific examples when we think about racism, ableism in combination. So the first is a short video from Dr. Calvin Zimmerman. So he is a researcher in the United States again. He more so documents that preschool to prison pipeline, and also looking at the ways in which Black children and racialized children are treated in early childhood spaces and the approaches to discipline. So I will share that video with you as well. But also, closer to home, in the region of Waterloo, I think I've seen that there's some people that are here today for the Institute from the region of Waterloo. And last year there was an instance where there was a police call on a 4-year-old Black boy in a kindergarten classroom. And news outlets actually reached out to our research project, the IECSS project, because there was the underlying issue of the potential of an undiagnosed disability, right? And the ways in which they criminalize this behavior of a 4-year-old to the point that you need to call in police interventions. Of course, we have to think about these are a great example of how race and ableism intersect in terms of harsher treatment on Black children or making assumptions about their behavior that are pathologized and based in criminality. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm actually going to share with you now a bit more about the IECSS project. So I mentioned that it is a longitudinal study, and we've interviewed families over a 6-year period, starting from prior to school entry and going into grade 3. And I joined the project in 2014 when we first began interviewing families specifically in Ontario, so with the county of Wellington, the district of Timiskaming, the city of Hamilton, and the city of Toronto. And the project has been developed through extensive partnerships with municipalities, with Indigenous organizations. It was also developed in collaboration with the District of Timiskaming Elders Council, who continue to consult on the project to ensure that the research is being done in a good way, as about a third of our participants also identify as Indigenous as well. And the project is also connected to a youth advisory council, an international advisory council, and also a Black advisory council that was recently created. And so the depth and the breadth of the project is quite widespread, and the focus of my PhD dissertation takes a subset of the data and is specific to Black families and examines how racism and ableism affect Black families' interactions with the service system. So when we're thinking about disability and all the other types of intersecting identities that there are, we consider a social relational model. And what this recognizes is that disablement is a result of the interaction between individual characteristics, so for example, whether it's genetic or environmental factors, social experiences, so families are experiencing poverty, racialization, and then access to community social capital, so such as early intervention services, childcare, and culturally safe supports. So we recognize that it's the system that disables individuals, right? In terms of people take sometimes a more medicalized view to disability in thinking about genetic disorders or things like that, but it's as children or individuals are interacting with their environments that it becomes disabling for them because they're not created from the outset to be accessible. And one of the key methodologies within the project is called institutional ethnography. So it is actually based in feminist theory, and the intention of institutional ethnography is to understand institutional cultures and practices from a particular standpoint. So in this study, it's from the standpoint of families. And it's concerned with how the rules of institutions shape everyday lives. So over the past 9 years of the study, a type of institutional mapping has been developed that helps to capture the experiences of families as they navigate through and interact with programs, with professionals across different service sectors and throughout the early years and into school age. So in terms of the project as well, it's also funded through a SHIRT partnership grant. Over several years, it's accumulated more and more research grants, so it has been thankful to continue to interview families due to the granting. And the next slide that I'm going to show actually demonstrates a map that's specific to a Black family in the study. So the way that our maps are created, on the left-hand side, you'll see labels that represent the different categories of different types of programs or institutions that families interact with. So you'll see health, pre- and postnatal, therapeutic or early intervention, early childhood education and care, family support, grants and subsidies, and also community, social, and justice services. So the map represents some of the interactions of a Black family who came in contact with early intervention and speech services through childcare and through resource consultation. At the bottom, the circles that you see, so the circles that are not filled in represent yearly milestones. and then those smaller blue circles are the months in between. And in terms of the images, so the diamond type shapes represent specific programs and institutions, and then the circles also represent professionals that families are engaging. And we track their referral pathways, whether it's self-referral, what type of wait times are they experiencing. We're also especially interested in the documentation that they have to complete in order to access service. So whether they need a specific diagnosis, whether they need to do an intake form, what responsibility is the institution putting on families in order to access supports. And so within this map, as I said, it represents the experience of a Black family. And the participant expressed how building rapport and cultural representation with service providers supported their feelings of cultural safety. So despite their skepticism of the developmental concerns that the early childhood professionals had regarding their child, they felt more at ease to be able to engage with certain programs and systems because of that rapport with someone who was more culturally like themselves. So there's this element of resistance or sometimes compliance that families must complete as they navigate through the system and decide to engage at each point. So within the project, the range of complexity of the maps also highlights the extensive work that systems and institutions impose on families in order to access the supports and the services that are oftentimes built on colonial understandings of race and disability, and can also have dangerous consequences for families as they navigate multiple systems. So we've also seen in our study whether families are adopted parents of their child, also families who identify as Indigenous. There is a concern and a danger when they're engaging with these systems. Will they have to engage with the child welfare system? Will there be issues that are perceived with their parenting style in terms of whether their children are safe or should be apprehended? So we've also seen that as well. And that intersection, again, of thinking it through race and disability is specific to Black and Indigenous people of color in terms of their family experiences. So for the next section, I actually wanted to spend a bit of time looking at another map that is specific to a video that has come out of our project. And our research project website is the Inclusive Early Childhood Service System Project. The website is inclusiveearlychildhood.ca. There is a wealth of information there in terms of policy briefs, videos, articles, book chapters, a lot of useful information. And so this short video takes a look again at one of the maps and just thinking through some of the experiences of families when we think about that intersection of race and disability.
If you're too fussy, you shouldn't be here at a time.
Also know that there are cultural factors in terms of who feels comfortable to do this kind of work interacting with services. So one of the things that we have found is that for disability services in particular, there's a medicalized way of thinking about children's development that may be inconsistent with some cultural groups. And in our study, about a third of the participants identify as First Nations or Métis, and we have found that many of them do not ascribe to that medicalized or Western way of thinking. And that can lead to exclusion from those programs. Lastly, I'd like to point out that when we talk about being inclusive of children and families, I believe that we're often talking about single programs. And one of the things that's really exciting about the Check It Out tool is that it looks at a range of programs and services and works across professional groups. And so one of the things that we've seen through our maps is that families may experience inclusion in one program, but not in many other places in their lives. So we're interested in rethinking the definition of what it means to be inclusive of the early years by thinking not just about having single programs that are inclusive, but creating an inclusive community for all children and all families.
So I'll actually pause it there, just again to give you the opportunity to see another one of what some of this institutional mapping looks like. But this is a family who is obviously engaged in more services, more professionals, more programs. So again, the complexity of these maps varies. And so I wanted to spend some time engaging with discussion and thinking about how this changes our understanding of the system and what families are experiencing, what's required of families to be able to access supports, and again, considering underlying cultural differences, racial differences, how does that affect their access, how does that affect their feelings of cultural safety as well. So I think Anita has a series of questions to share with you all as well, just in terms of taking a look at the map and thinking through what are some of the things that kind of stand out to you initially when looking at the institutional experiences of families and what's required of them to engage with these urban systems. So you can actually just share with the person beside you, I think, just so that we're not moving around too much. I know it's very hot in here. But just to kind of start off, initially when you kind of look at these images, is there something that comes to mind?
In addition to how families are accessing all these services in terms of transportation, I also wonder about when they're accessing, because a lot of these services are only open during the day, which pulls parents away from work, which pulls away from income, pulls the child away from school. So there's not a system that is well integrated and centered around the child.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Thinking of that centering of the child and the family, because even within our study, we see families who there is an element of privilege in terms of those who are actually getting the services that they want, whether they're having to pay out of pocket, whether they have access to a flexible work schedule that they can actually attend the different supports that they need, whether they have an accessible child care space. Absolutely. And oftentimes, so they may require that diagnosis to be able to kind of open the door to the different supports. But as you said, do they kind of reach like a saturation level of we've already accessed so many things, it's already taken so much out of us to get to this point, and thinking through what's actually useful to that family. And when we think about this opportunity for accessible childcare, imagine if a family was able to engage with their local childcare center, have access to some of these typical interventions that we see in terms of speech and language or occupational therapy, physical therapy, to have them on site, to have a resource consultant there as well to help to kind of gauge that relationship with ECEs and the family and the child, and having that hub kind of set up to be able to access that on a daily basis when their child is already in care, instead of having to kind of, jump through their hoops and figure things out on their own and going to multiple places, filling out multiple forms, talking to multiple people. How are we really putting that burden on families?
Yeah, I wanted to add too is that sometimes, sometimes it's hard to get that diagnosis because there is a bias in the medical field, and if you're low income or you're Black or you're a woman, sometimes you don't get the diagnosis that you want because it's just not taken seriously, and then that's that many more hoops you have to jump through.
Absolutely, and often with children, we see sometimes that whole wait and see philosophy that some pediatricians or family doctors have. But we of course understand the critical period of that early intervention period to be able to access those supports if needed, even if they're in the end are not needed. it's still a useful tool for families to be able to have access to kind of work through their concerns.
I also just noticed there's a lot of schools on this list too, and thinking about all of the different relationships they have to manage and all the ways they have to trust people with their children, and being vulnerable and open to maybe that being taken advantage of, or there being an incident that might be against what is actually helpful for their child, and thinking about how that dynamic will be between just a bunch of different schools with different ways of doing things, and yeah, how that can affect them too.
Absolutely, and especially over like a short period of time. And as I mentioned, some families go through, I think there's one in the family in the study where they were denied at least from 5 different child cares within their city, and then they had to kind of look into their own options for childcare. And so going through each of these spaces, what does that look like for the child specifically, right? For their experience.
Oh, we need the mic for you.
So in addition to that, and something you've also mentioned is that some programs say inclusive, but what really does inclusion mean for disabled kids, especially Black disabled kids? You know, is it just something like an extra worker? Great, that's good for safety, but how are you actually intentionally including them in activities, not just like as an oh yeah, maybe we should do something with this disabled child. Like, are there adaptive play toys, play settings to include, so like, can disabled kids be themselves and full selves in each of these you know, environments that they're interacting with? Or are they just kind of seen as a burden that you have to accommodate rather than just really include and, you know, value them in a sense?
Thank you for that, especially I love how you mentioned letting them be themselves and valuing who they are. Another thing for consideration, of course, is the way in which their families or their culture values that. So we've also seen through our study, especially when engaging with Indigenous worldviews, often in certain Indigenous languages, there isn't even a word for disability. And so they see the difference in their child as a gift, as something that's a blessing, as something that's to learn from and has a purpose in their lives. And so when they're in these childcare spaces on a day-to-day basis, are the professionals that they're interacting with considering and honoring their identities in the same way?
It's not, yeah, it's more of a comment. I guess it's so frustrating to see this as a parent that's gone through the system and also someone who's worked in the system. And it feels like this is amazing work that needs to be happening, but we, as an ECE or as someone in a position center, we don't have the power to make decisions like, we should add money to the budget so that we could add the necessary staffing to make sure that, A, they're safe, but so that we could do some impactful programming. That's not happening. I don't see it happening in the years of my touring of places. It's literally like people, it's like Lord of the Flies or something. Like, it's kind of like everybody's just surviving and coping and finding ways to get through as staff. But then you have these families that experience a very healthy distress in the system because the system has this turnover because nobody's getting paid enough. So it's just this like very frustrating cycle.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think we, just for time, we'll take one more.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say that when we talk about children who are needing a diagnosis, a lot of the times children get misdiagnosed because of cultural biases. We may have a child who is diagnosed ADHD when it's not necessarily ADHD, it's because of culture. They were told, oh, it's just the way it is, or something like that. And I've worked with children in need to advocate on behalf of the children to make sure that things are streamlined and not just based on those things.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. And it actually ties in well to the video that I did not share, but if you have time to look at Dr. Calvin Zimmerman's work, in that exact thing, in terms of thinking about disciplinary measures for children who, whether they end up, having suspension or having expulsion or having to leave the child care center, it's oftentimes harsher treatment for children of color, especially Black children. So I just wanted to spend some time sharing some of the policy recommendations that have come out of the research project specifically. Because as we're talking about, although the map there kind of puts it in your face of what's happening in the system, we all kind of have an understanding of what's been going on for a long time, right? And trying to get the information into the hands of the policymakers and decision makers who can allocate that funding and help to make some changes within the system. So within the project, of course, we can see different institutional responses to childhood disability that affect families' access to early intervention and childcare. And there are cultural factors that can affect who feels comfortable accessing services, whether they are skeptical of going through the process of diagnosis, whether they're valuing of their child's identity, what does that mean to them as a family as well. So there are three sections of policy that we consider when we're thinking about rights-based, economics-based, and inclusion policy implications. So from a rights-based policy standpoint, disabled children need to better access to disability and developmental services in addition to their child care or specifically within a child care setting. And this approach requires the removal of qualifying criteria for supports that are connected to medical and standardized assessments, integrating the coordination of services for universal access, and holding those spaces for families that are most vulnerable, and family support to engage with these systems. Often the family needs the support to take into account the cultural safety, especially when we're thinking about Black, Indigenous, and people of color and their families. And so for the national child care strategy to support the economic well-being of families and disabled children, it must include a public funding for disability services and universal access through child care and family support programs, and recognition of not only monetary but relational contributions of families to the system, no penalty for those who are unemployed or those who are experiencing poverty, right, and making it universally accessible, and prioritizing mechanisms for the participation of families who have not been participating fully in the system. And of course, giving families that option, because again, we talked about there can be that danger of skepticism as well. And finally, as we're thinking about the ways that disability and difference is conceptualized in developmentalism when we're thinking about young children, it's often from that kind of medicalized point of view, right? In terms of identification, referral, intervention, that's what we're typically used to. But this history does not mean that the experiences of children and families with disabilities and their specific interests should be ignored. So valuing their difference allows for a range of family, community, and cultural viewpoints, and it's critical for striving towards a system that recognizes those inequalities based in racism, ableism, and ongoing colonization. So I leave you with a few points as we think specifically about the Canada, the National Child Care Plan that's rolling out. To think about the disabling of Black childhoods that often begins in the early years through labels, through assumptions placed on a child's behaviors and abilities. Thinking about quality childcare and action-oriented inclusion must be at the center of the experiences of Black families, and understanding, of course, the work that the families do to engage with the system and the privilege that comes with navigating the system. So we have an opportunity to reimagine a transformative, inclusive system that makes space for intersectional experiences for families with multiple identities. So we'll actually pause there and just direct you to some of the resources that we have through the research project. So what I shared with you here, there's one article called The Role of Childcare in Creating Inclusive Communities and Access for All. That was an article published in Canadian Public Policy Journal. There's also a policy brief that I developed with the project on the Black experience with disabled childhoods, comparing federal and provincial policies. I mentioned that we have 12 different policy briefs in our study. The most recent one that kind of summarizes all of the recommendations that we've been talking about, it has 9 years and puts it in one place to share with policymakers. And then different advocacy and research endeavors that are specific to thinking about Black experiences and disability and how to support families through their navigation system. So thank you so much for your time today.